This video is on Punnett Squares. So here's an interesting question. Can brown-eyed parents have blue-eyed children? To figure out the answer to that question, we're going to have to learn about Punnett Squares. On the screen, you can see an example of a Punnett Square. The Punnett Square is simply a square diagram that is used to predict the possible genotypes and the probability of genotypes of a particular cross. In this example, the word cross means if you have two parents that reproduce, what are the possible genotypes of their offspring, and what is the probability of those genotypes? So if two parents reproduced, what genotypes could the offspring have, and how likely are those genotypes? A few reminders. First is that all organisms have two copies of a gene. So parents have two possible genes to pass down to offspring. Genes also come in varieties called alleles. Finally, dominant alleles overpower recessive alleles. A reminder that a dominant allele is always expressed, while a recessive allele is only expressed if there is no dominant. In our first example, let's take a look at these two bean plants. You can see the parent number 1 has a genotype of dominant G and recessive G, while the genotype of parent 2 is 2 recessive Gs. We want to figure out what kind of offspring would these parents have. Again, it's important to remember that one gene from the offspring will come from parent 1, and one gene in the offspring will come from parent 2. We don't know which gene is going to be passed on. That's part of the randomness of reproduction, but we can use a Punnett square to figure out what genotypes are possible and what the probability of those genotypes is. To find the answer to that question, we'll use a Punnett square, and the Punnett square will tell us what possible genotypes the offspring have and how likely those genotypes are. So we start by drawing a simple 4-square box. The genotype of one parent goes on the left, and the genotype of the second parent goes on the top. We then look at all the possible combinations of those parents. Let's imagine that parent number 1 passes on the dominant G to its offspring, and parent number 2 passes on one recessive G to its offspring. That offspring would have one dominant and one recessive G. But you could also get this combination, where parent 1 passes on the dominant and parent 2 passes on the other recessive gene. You would still get an offspring with one dominant and one recessive. But what if parent number 1 passes on a recessive G? Parent 2 would also pass on a recessive G, so you could get an offspring with 2 recessive Gs. And the same thing would happen in the 4th combination. With our Punnett square complete, now we can answer those questions. What are the possible genotypes, and what is the likelihood of those genotypes? So first off, what are all the possible genotypes? Well, with these parents, offsprings could be dominant G, recessive G, or 2 recessive Gs. And what is the probability, or how likely are those genotypes? Well, for dominant recessive G, you can see that 2 of the 4 squares are possible, which means there's a 50% chance that the offspring will have that genotype. And recessive G is also in 2 out of 4 squares, which means it is also a 50% likelihood that offspring will have 2 recessive Gs. But let's go back to our main question. Can brown-eyed parents have blue-eyed children? For this, it's important to know that brown is dominant to blue. So a parent with brown eyes might be dominant B, or they might be dominant recessive B, but they would still have brown eyes. Blue eyes only come about if somebody has 2 recessive alleles for B. In this example, we're going to pretend that both parents are dominant recessive for brown eyes. Again, we start with our blank Punnett square. We'll put parent number 1 on the left and parent number 2 on the right. Now we can go through all the possible combinations that these parents might provide to their offspring. So parent number 1 and parent number 2 might both pass down a dominant gene, or parent number 1 might pass a dominant and parent number 2 would pass a recessive. Or you might get the flip. Parent number 1 might provide the recessive and parent number 2 would provide the dominant. The final combination is that both parent number 1 and parent number 2 provide a recessive allele. With our Punnett square complete, we can now look at what are the possible genotypes and how likely are they. Alright, so the first thing we can look at is what are all the possible genotypes. Here you can see that the offspring might have a dominant B, they could have a dominant recessive B, or they might have 2 recessive Bs. We can also look at the probability of those genotypes. If these 2 parents reproduce, we can see that 1 out of the 4 boxes results in a dominant genotype. 1 out of 4 means that there's a 25% chance that the offspring would be dominant. On the other hand, there's 2 out of 4 boxes where the offspring would have a dominant recessive genotype. So there's a 50% chance that their offspring would have 1 dominant and 1 recessive. And finally, there's 1 box with 2 recessive alleles, which means that there's a 25% chance that the offspring would have 2 recessive alleles for that genotype. The more interesting question is, what is the probability of each phenotype? Reminder that brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes, so a single dominant gene would result in a brown-eyed child. Here we can see that 3 out of the 4 combinations result in a brown-eyed child. So if these 2 parents reproduced, there's a 75% chance that they would have a brown-eyed child. But there is a 1 out of 4 or a 25% chance that they could have a blue-eyed child. So, can brown-eyed parents have blue-eyed children? The answer is yes, but it really depends on the genotype of the parents and the probability that those 2 parents pass on 2 recessive alleles.